This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center for research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. We're very happy to welcome today our guest, Karnit Flug. Professor Karnit Flug served for 5 years as the governor of the Bank of Israel until November 2018. Prior to her appointment as the governor, Professor Flug was the Bank of Israel's deputy governor, then acting director, and served for 10 years as the director of research department and chief economist for the Bank of Israel. She has worked at the International Monetary Fund, at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. She received her PhD in economics from Columbia University in 1985. And in 2018, she was awarded an honorary doctoral degree from Tel Aviv University. In 2019, she joined the Department of Economics at the Hebrew University, and she is currently a vice president for research in the fields of government and economics at the Israel Democracy Institute. Karnit Flug, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with a big picture. How is the health of the Israeli economy? We hear an awful lot about Israel's fantastic economic performance, but the data compilations that you show a somewhat more mixed, maybe a little more complex picture. Where are the areas where Israel excels economically, and in what areas is Israel lagging compared to other countries and in general?
So, first of all, when we think about the macroeconomic situation in Israel, it's quite good. It has been quite good for a while. In fact, since the global financial crisis, which Israel has passed with, I would say, very minor negative effects, we recovered very quickly, and growth has been relatively solid ever since. Unemployment is at a record low. Wages are growing. The labor market is quite tight and strong. We have seen people that were not in the labor market before actually joining the labor market. So we've seen an increase in the participation in the labor market. And all the indicators from a macroeconomic standpoint are quite good. Inflation,
sounds good.
Yeah, definitely good. And many countries, I think, would be happy to see these kind of macroeconomic results.
But I hear a but coming.
There is a but coming. And the but has few dimensions. First of all, growth, although it has been healthy, we've been growing at a little bit more than 3% annually, but if you take into account the fact that our population grows at about 1.7% annually, so the per capita growth has been more modest. The other but is that the benefits or the economic growth does not improve the lives of everybody at the same way. In fact, the Israeli economy is characterized by quite significant gaps in income and in socioeconomic position of different groups.
Which is a big change from the first early years of Israel's history, is that right?
Well, I think that actually there is a myth that the economy was very equal in the early years, and there is a question about that. However, the inequality has increased significantly since the early 2000s. It reached very high levels. Also, the rate of poverty has grown to very significant numbers, but it has been coming down in recent years.
Yeah, I noticed in the data that you provided that there was a time when people used to constantly repeat the refrain that Israel was number one in the inequality index relative to OECD countries, and it is no longer number one. It seems like it's number 6 or 7.
Something like that. Yeah, so there has definitely been progress in that respect.
Is that thanks to government policy?
To some extent.
What kind?
Okay, so I would say that the fact that we've seen in the early 2000s a rise in inequality and in the rates of poverty was related to a severe cut in welfare in welfare payments. And that actually provided a strong incentive for people who previously relied on allowances to re-enter the labor market. However, they entered, at least initially, at the very lowest levels of wages. So we've seen at that time a very significant rise in poverty. And with the entry of these people into the labor market, we've seen an increase in the income, in the family income. And that has started to show up also in the inequality numbers. So we've seen an increase in overall income of people who are at the bottom of the income distribution, with additional labor input or additional breadwinners from these families getting into the labor market. So this is definitely a very positive development, and I would say that here the government strategy of which was coined from welfare to work has certainly seen in a significant increase in the engagement in the labor market of this population. However, and there is a however, the wages of a lot of these new entrants to the labor market are still quite low, and that has to do with the level of human capital, which we can obviously talk about.
So will the problem resolve itself at some point?
The problem, I'm not sure it will resolve itself. It needs government policies that would now move from dealing, I would say, with the quantity to the quality of employment strategy. The quantity being what I've described before, incentivizing people to get into the labor market. However, many of them have jobs that are not quality jobs or that are reflected in relatively low wages that, at least to some extent, reflect low quality of human capital, of the kind of skills for the labor market at this day and age.
Is that why the record low number of unemployment can be misleading? Because another data piece that you've given us is that productivity is relatively low. So it's not enough to have people in active participation. There needs to be more than that, right?
Just for the record, though, I think productivity requires a whole conversation in itself, right?
We can talk about that also. I'm not sure that today we can cover it in a proper way, but I think that the unemployment numbers are not misleading. They're measuring what they're supposed to be measuring, and that's the part of the population that wants to work and cannot find jobs, that is actively seeking employment but cannot find. And this is the standard way to measure it. It does not give an indication as to the quality of employment. And there you have to look at wages and the distribution of wages. And in Israel, the distribution of wages is quite uneven, or there is high inequality. You have people who are highly skilled, employed in the high-tech sector, for example, that earn very good wages, and you have a lot of other people that are employed mostly in personal services and other services and commerce who earn very modest wages. So the inequality in wages is quite large, and at least to some degree it reflects the inequality in skills that are relevant to the labor market. Maybe one point that I should also mention is that there are two groups that still have very low rates of participation, and that is Arab women and ultra-Orthodox men. So although the overall picture is positive, there are still two groups that have low engagement in the labor market and are also accordingly have high poverty incidence and so on.
I want to ask you specifically about those groups, because when we talk about income inequality and in general socioeconomic inequality in Israel, we are generally talking about the Arab community and Haredi community. Given what you just said about the participation rates of those groups, is the opposite true? In other words, do we see a high rate of workplace participation for Arab men and for Haredi women?
We see much higher rates of participation in Arab men relative to Arab women, but it's still lower than non-Orthodox Jewish men. And the same is true about Haredi women, although there I have to say that over the last 10 or 15 years ago, the change has been dramatic. The increase in
changes. Yeah.
participation of women in the Haredi community, they went up from maybe about 60 to 75%, around this number. I will have to check that to be precise. And that's definitely impressive. I should note, though, that many of the Haredi women work part-time because you have to remember that they have very large families, many kids to attend. So normally their number of hours work is significantly lower than for the rest of the population.
But we also know that the Arab community has been participating at greater and greater rates in higher education over the years. Is this translating into generally rising workforce participation at more professional levels?
It is translating, but the process is slow. So the numbers that you have talked about is a fairly recent phenomena. So although there is an increase, for example, of Arab graduates in the high-tech sector, the percentages are still very small, and I believe that it will increase over time. I think here the fact that, for example, the high-tech sector has shortage of skilled people, of people with the right education, is actually an opportunity for people from the Arab population with the right skills to sort of penetrate and get into that sector, which was fairly close to them until a few years ago.
How does this low participation within these two rather sizable community not affect the macro figures?
Why do we assume it doesn't?
That's what I'm asking. Well, because it's as you said, it's on the macro level, it's doing very well. I'm asking, could it do even better? And if not, why is it not doing worse?
Okay. First of all, it is certainly affecting the current situation. I have to say that in spite of the fact that these groups have very low rates of participation, when you look at the rate of participation of the overall Israeli population, it's higher than the average OECD country, which means that the others are actually participating at much higher rates. But I think it's a very important question, especially when we look ahead and when we look at the demographic changes in Israel and the expected change in the composition of the population. What we will see is a significant increase in the proportion of the ultra-Orthodox community. And if we do not see a much greater participation at higher quality jobs, I think the strain on the economy which will become greater and greater. So I think that we have been paying a certain price, and they pay a price because these communities are much, much poorer than the rest of Israelis. But it's also true that Israel as a whole, if we don't see a very significant change in the pattern of engagement in the labor market of especially the ultra-Orthodox community, the burden on the Israeli economy will be much greater. The potential tax collections will be lower, so you need to provide more services from a shrinking tax base, and that is definitely, I would say, a strategic challenge that Israel has to deal with.
True, although I have to add that there's some very good research out there about the attrition rate from the ultra-Orthodox community. So we have to eventually keep that in mind, that we're not looking just at birth rates.
That's true, but I think that even with a significant attrition rate, the birth rate are so high that the proportion of this community from the overall population. According to the current or most recent demographic projections, they will reach around a quarter of the population by 2050. And that's already, it's a very solid projection because, it's mostly counting people that have already been born. So, that's the projection.
Okay. I mean, I want to ask a question that will maybe be a little bit of a segue into the broader political conversation, which is about the budget deficit. Everybody has this image of our prime minister as Mr. Economic Success. And I think he's been campaigning on this over the last number of election cycles. But all of a sudden, there is a problem that the budget deficit is not meeting its target as a percentage of GDP. Why is that? Can you explain what this means and why is it happening, do you think?
Right. So the budget deficit target for 2019 was 2.9% of GDP, and now it's projected to be close to 4% of GDP. And that's basically a result of overly optimistic projections of revenues, which, by the way, these kind of deviations are not unusual. But in the previous 3 years, the deviation between the actual collection and the projections was positive, which means the collection was higher than what was projected, and this year it's lower. And also the spending rose a little bit more than was expected. But I think more generally, in recent years, I would say that there was some loosening of the fiscal discipline. And I think that because of some positive surprises in tax collections in previous years, there was some expectation that will always be the case, but it has not always been the case, and recently we see a deviation. I think the main problem is what you do about this deviation. And here, I think the fact that we have been in this very long political deadlock and a series of elections delays the remedies of this problem until there is a government. The willingness of an interim government to tackle the problem is not there. And the longer we delay the problem, the greater it becomes. And that's where I see a risk. I think that's part of the cost of the political deadlock. But there are other costs as well.
I want to pick up on that and ask you whether you just see that it might delay the remedy to the problems, or, the ongoing, some would say, chronic political instability in Israel may spiral out of control. Is that a real threat to the Israeli economy?
I don't think so. And we've had periods in the past where elections had been delayed, not quite the same way as now, but governments normally, after being elected, did some, by the way, even before, some interim committees did take some corrective steps even before elections, but that's not happening now. But I do believe that once a government is elected and it will have the perspective of 4 years, they will take some measures to actually correct the imbalance, fiscal imbalance. I have to say that in recent years, I think that the budgets were generally, as I said, a little bit more loose than should have been the case given the state of the economy. So I think in a way we did not deal with the growing deficit that could have been seen earlier on when it was relatively easy, when the economy has been doing quite well. And given that there are some clouds on the horizons regarding the global economy, and that may have an effect on the Israeli economy as well, it might be more difficult to deal with the growing deficit in a year or so when a new government will take office.
I want to ask you about this political question. To what extent do you think the parties really espouse radically different views on what should be done with Israel's economy? I mean, you're telling us what you think the government should do. It sounds pragmatic to me. Is there any leading party of the so-called center, right, or left that would disagree with you? And do you expect very different directions if there's a continued Likud leadership or a change of government?
Judging by past behavior, I don't see a radical difference between the different parties regarding economic policy. There are some differences in the weights that are given to different policies. But I see one common feature, I would say, of the current contenders, and that is all are promising better education, better health and higher spending on the health sector, more investment in infrastructure, and almost none of them are saying how they will finance these very positive promises. I do think we need to deal with the civilian services that are I think, quite modest in quality and in some areas in quantity relative to countries of the same GDP per capita. But the willingness to at least recognize before the elections that if you really want to deal with these issues, you will have to also raise more revenues. That has not been the case for any of the parties, almost any of the parties.
Is this what we would call economic populism because they're making big grand promises and they don't even try to back them up? Or is there some sort of other particular strain of economic populism that you see in Israel in the political rhetoric?
Well, I think that it's not unusual for politicians to promise a lot of policies that will make the lives of people easier and provide more services.
But specifically without saying how they'll do it. Do it. On the other hand, I just want to point out that if you're following the parallel discussions in the U.S. now, I think certainly the Democratic candidates are under a great deal of scrutiny about how they will actually pay for these very grandiose economic promises that they're giving. And I don't know if we see that kind of scrutiny here.
No, actually, I would say that in general, economic matters do not have a very prominent place in the political debate in Israel. Here, maybe I should mention that we here at the Democracy Institute had a survey and we asked people about their views about economic policy, and we got some very interesting results. We asked people whether, what do they think should be the priorities and whether the government should spend more on social services such as health, social security, education. And here, predominantly, the answer was yes. 86% of the population said that the government should spend more on all of these.
This is a country full of Bernie Sanders voters.
Of course. By the way, most people did not think that we should spend more on defense. And in fact, it's the only area where there was a significant proportion of people surveyed who said that the defense spending should be cut. However, when we asked the people who want more civilian spending, whether they're willing to pay higher taxes for that, only 36% said yes. But then
that is also one of the oldest contradictions in the study of public opinion research and democracies.
Right. So it's very interesting. But then we dug a little bit further. We asked the people who said that spending should be raised, but were not willing to pay higher taxes. What are the reasons why they're not willing to pay higher taxes? And the dominant answer was we don't trust the government for actually doing what it says it will. We gave them lots of options. For example, one of the options was, would you not pay higher taxes because you think that the services will go to a different group And there were very few people who said that. So there was no clear sign of lack of solidarity, more an issue of trust. Then when we asked them specifically, would you be willing to pay higher taxes for improving the social security or health, the health system, there already half of the population, half of the surveyed people said, yes, we're willing to pay higher taxes. So that was interesting. And so if it seems like there will be specific use for the higher taxes, there is more willingness to pay.
Yeah, people have strong views about economic policy, yet they don't really cast a vote accordingly. And as you said, generally the Israeli public is indifferent to economic policy and economic issues, perhaps with the big exception of the social movement of 2011. At the time, you were deputy governor of the Bank of Israel when it erupted. And it was, I think, the biggest protest movement in Israel's history about economic issues. Did it take you and other economists that, your milieu of leading economists in the country, economic policy makers, did it take you by surprise? Did you see it coming?
I don't think we saw it coming. I think there was a surprise. By the way, to some extent, similarly as the eruption of recent protests, for example, in Chile. That is a very well-run country from a macroeconomic standpoint. I happen to be familiar with Chile because I did some work there. And I visited Chile in July, and nobody spoke, and I met a lot of people, nobody spoke about something that was brewing. And then the trigger was a very small increase in the price of public transportation. And here the trigger was the rise in prices of cottage cheese. That was the trigger for the protest. Then, it's sort of what was, I would say, one of the big areas that troubled people is the rising housing prices, and the protest broadened to really issues such as
exactly. It echoed much broader issues, and the Chile example is excellent because it's not just the Israeli case, but we can perhaps generalize and ask, why is it that in countries that are on the macro level are run so well, there's still such great resentment of the people, and why is there such disconnect?
I think at least partly is because not everybody is benefiting to the same extent from growth, and inequality, both in Israel at the time, now it's somewhat lower, but it's still high, and in Chile is also very high. So I think the fact that people hear every day about, great news about their economy, but they don't feel that they're part of those who benefit from it. I think it sort of breeds discontent and frustration.
Let's be very focused about this. And also, I do want to remind people that based on your data, only about 8% of the Israeli workforce works in high tech. So we hear about this wonderful high tech miracle and all these wonderful IPOs and Israeli patents. They're going to a very small sector. And the rest of us, and not only the lower classes, right? I want to remind also everybody that revolutions start from the middle class. And I'm one of those citizens who finds Israel extraordinarily expensive on a day-to-day level. Now, I know this isn't your fault, but I do want to ask you, why is the cost of living so high in Israel relative to our incomes?
Well, it's actually a very complex question. I think it has to do with... it's not the nominal cost. Let me say something here, and it is related to the issue of productivity. When you think about Norway, if you check how much a haircut in Norway would cost, it would cost probably, I don't know how many times as much as in Israel. But nobody talks, more, of course. It's very expensive.
But I go to New York all the time and stuff costs less.
Well, I don't know about New York. But the fact that the cost nominally is higher is not a concern if wages and incomes are are higher
Commensurate,
accordingly,
yeah.
right? So, there was another protest in Israel which was called the Milky Protest, and people compared the cost of this, I don't know how you...
Dessert, a junk food dessert.
Right, a junk food dessert in Israel, and the same exact one in Berlin, and it turned out that here it's more expensive. But this is not the issue. The issue is salaries, and the issue is income. And therefore, I think policies should deal less with the price of butter or cottage cheese and more with how we make the population have the skills that would allow them to have better jobs, higher paying jobs, and higher incomes, and that would solve the issue. Now, going back to the high tech, yes, only 9% of the population is in high tech. By the way, I think it's still very important for the economy as a whole, and I think it has some spillovers to some other sectors. I would want to see more of these spillovers. I would want to see more of the innovation that originates in the high-tech sector spills over to other sectors of the economy. And here again, I think the fact that our population as a whole doesn't have the necessary skills to even adopt the cutting-edge technology is where the weakness lies. And recently we've seen the new results of the PISA tests, which are the standardized tests that measure the abilities of kids aged 15 in math, in reading, in sciences, and we are, I think it's very worrisome because the average is quite low and the gaps are huge and they have increased. So I would say that the top priority should be improving the education and focus especially on improving the quality of teachers so that we really prepare these kids for their future engagement in the labor market.
And this is perhaps a concluding question of sorts. We'll see what Dalia says about that. In all the data that you sent us, in the graphs, there's quite a clear slump, a decline in the years between just after 2001, 2002, following a recession that happened in the beginning of that decade. And you said earlier in this conversation that Israel weathered the second recession of that decade pretty well. Now, in the event of another recession coming upon us, and we all know that in economics it's just a matter of time, do you think that Israel now is better equipped to deal with a recession of such magnitude as the one almost 20 years ago?
I think in some areas it is, and in some areas we have to strengthen our resilience. You compared two recessions, one in the early 2000s, where the global recession was quite mild, but in Israel the combination of the burst of the dot-com bubble with the global recession and with the local intifada, the terrorist wave, led to a fairly severe recession. But what made things worse was that the public policy or the government policy could not then follow expansionary policy to alleviate the recession. In fact, it needed to impose severe austerity or government spending cuts in the middle of the recession because with very high debt to GDP ratio, the markets were not willing to finance, or they were willing to finance at a very high cost, the budget deficit. Go fast forward to 2009, by then the debt to GDP ratio had declined very significantly. And then, in spite of the fact that the deficit went up once again, markets were willing to finance it, and the government could follow expansionary policy that helped alleviate the recession. That's one of the major reasons why I think the correction of the current deficit should be top priority, because we need to have the fiscal space to react to shocks. And as you said, shocks come once in a while, we don't know when. In other areas, I think that the economy is quite resilient. For example, in all the area of the financial sector, it was resilient in 2009, which was one of the areas of strength that helped Israel to get through the global financial crisis without paying too severe a price, because our financial system remained solid.
You mean we had credit? Is that what it means?
We had credit. We had no failure of any financial institution, which was something that made things much worse in many other parts of the world. And in that respect, I think we continue to strengthen the resilience of the financial system since then. So in that sense, I think we're prepared quite well.
Now, one more question, but it's really not my fault. Actually, we want to add a particular question about the conference that will have already happened by the time this is published. But tell us what you think is the major goal of the Eli Horowitz Conference on Economy and Society, which is in mid-December, that the Israel Democracy Institute is hosting. And what do you think is the central question that needs to be understood?
I think the role or the importance of this conference is that it deals with the most important issues regarding the Israeli economy from a long-term perspective, and introduce or even force a discussion that looks at major issues that should affect policy now, so as to deal with issues with a very important long-term benefit. Issues such as what should be the strategy of economic policy? How should we prepare for the changing demands of the labor market by preparing the human capital or people to the labor market of the 21st century? How should we deal with aging population in terms of preparing and providing the skills that would allow aging people to remain in the labor market, something that we should all be worried about. And other issues, also issue of economic policy to ensure that that takes into account environmental sustainability, things that that our politicians tend to sort of put aside because they don't deal with immediate issues, and dealing with them do not give you an immediate electoral benefit, but I think are very important to be put on the agenda and sort of discussed in a thorough way. So that's what the conference will do.
All right. Professor Karnit Flug, Vice President of the Israel Democracy Institute and former Governor of the Bank of Israel. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, as well as the Israel Democracy Institute for the generous support. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You can also support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And don't forget to follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.